welcome everybody. I don't know if you want to turn your cameras on so we can see your faces this evening. Welcome to the third session of the Classical Philosophy Reading Group. And it's really nice to see you. I think we've still got some people filtering in. I want to start with a quote from Meno, in fact, by Socrates. "We must therefore carry on the search as long as life lasts, and not grow weary of the search, for otherwise we shall be bound to pass our lives in ignorance, and that would be disgraceful." So I am here to say thank you very much for deciding not to pass your life in ignorance and being disgraceful. Socrates obviously there talking about the philosophical life, and hopefully, that's why we're here this evening, to kind of engage with that. You may have found in the reading this time that we're dealing with some really quite profound questions and ideas, some really deep, meaty material. And it's pretty demanding in places. I don't know if you've experienced aporia yet. I know I have. We'll look at that whole concept later on, but this sort of struggle to understand things. But fear not, we have a great guide this evening, as with all of our sessions. We're going to be led in this search for the philosophical life by David Perks, former head teacher, and now very keen on not just getting to grips with Plato and Socrates' ideas in his own life, but sharing that with others and taking the rest of us along with him. So, welcome, Dave. It's great to have you here again. I think before we get stuck into the dialogues that we've been reading, you want to speak a little bit, just for a few minutes, about Athenian democracy. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm kind of get the opportunity to sort of look a little bit broader about Athens and its significance. So and I think it came up a couple of times in the last session that people were really interested in what is Athenian democracy. So bear with me, a few minutes, not many. So I'm going to try, he says, because this is always dangerous, to share my screen. There you go. Can you see that? Does that come through?
Yep, right, we can see that nice and clearly.
Right, okay. So if you want to read about the history of Athens, then Herodotus, the histories, that's the one to go for. And that's, if you want to go for the original, one of the first historians ever. And so I've taken bits of this from book 5 and book 1, actually, a little bit. So very briefly, how did democracy come about? Because it's kind of like the thing that we celebrate most about. All right, so the thing I wanted to make out clearly is that obviously Greek democracy did not start from democracy, it started from something else. And I think it's really useful to sort of get a feel for this. So the historical chronology I've got starts with a guy called Cylon, who was an Athenian who attempted to take over the establishment by sort of marching on the Acropolis and trying to overthrow the government, and it failed. And he wasn't the only one who'd done this. There was quite a lot of people who wanted to become the tyrant of Athens and run Athens under their own rule. And he was defeated and dispatched, killed. His supporters were killed. But what this led to was a situation in which the Athenians knew they had to do something because this was getting out of hand. So then they asked a guy called Draco to write a constitution. And I didn't realize this until I read it, but this is the notion of draconian. comes from Draco's constitution, which he brought in for the Athenians, which basically meant that almost any crime you committed, you were going to get the death penalty, hence the draconian use of the word. And this was an attempt to kind of stifle attempts to overthrow the government. But it went a bit too far and didn't really settle things down. So then they had to bring in another constitution, which is this guy Solon's constitution, which got rid of all the death penalty stuff, unless you'd murder somebody, serious crime, and tried to reframe the constitution in a way which then brought in the idea that you could appeal to a council if you thought you were being mistreated. And so the beginnings of democracy came out of the attempt to try and stop the rule of tyrants just coming in and basically marching up the Acropolis and taking over. However, it didn't stop. So then the next part of the history is a guy called, and I'm going to get his name really badly wrong, Pisistratus, who tried to become tyrant 3 times. 3 times he tried to overrun the place, and only on the 3rd time did he succeed. And in so doing, became tyrant, but didn't get rid of all the mechanisms of government that Athens already had, left them in place, but just oversaw the whole thing through himself and his family. So the whole idea was that tyrants put their families in charge, and this, when he died, his son, his eldest son, Hippias, took over as tyrant of Athens, and that was the idea. You tried to keep the thing as a family sort of rule, but he wasn't exactly popular, and in the attempt to suppress opposition, he ended up killing quite a lot of people, as a result of which his opposition to him from a family, a big important family in Athens, then invited the Spartans to help them to overthrow Hippias and remove the tyrant, which would have put them in charge. And the Spartans did this. They came in and they overrun the tyrant, and then you had the situation, well, what comes next? And it's in this mess of what came next that the resolution was two big players from this family that had overrun the tyrants then vied for power, and the one that won out in the end, Cleisthenes, won because he appealed to the populace, he appealed to the people, and he brought in reforms which gave them more of a say in government, and enhanced the power of the councils that were running, and gave more access to those councils than had previously been there. So as a result of which, that's where the first real attempt to institute a democracy can be seen to have happened in Athens. And so it came out of a fight. It didn't just emerge in a natural way. It was an attempt to resolve conflicts against the Athenian government, the populace, and so on. And it ended in just shortly after, when the Spartans were brought back to try and remove this new democratic regime, and the people rose up and defeated the Spartans. And so that's really what cemented democracy in Athens. So that's my short, brief history.
Very good, Dave. Thanks very much. I've put the timeline back on the screen just for a moment there. Could you just, before we sort of conclude that bit, just then sort of make really explicit for people the reason that this democratic impulse is important in the context of Plato's dialogues and so
on? Well, yeah, Plato wasn't a fan. So, and you have to. It's actually later the consequences of what I've just described are that this set in train and animosity between Sparta and Athens that never went away. So, because Sparta thought of themselves as the major Greek state who could settle disputes in other states, they were brought in as a kind of armed sort of expression of force to resolve conflicts. When they were defeated by the Athenian people, that didn't go down very well. So they did not have a democracy, had an oligarchy, which maybe I'll explain in a different session, but I don't want to try and do it now. But it was a counterpoint, a very distinct counterpoint to Athenian democracy, and in the subsequent wars between Sparta and Athens, Athens lost, and you know, so it's hard to put it all into one go. But Athens lost, and as a result of that, on the back of that, that's where you can situate Plato's attempt to explain things. He saw the problem of Athens was you know, its democracy led to its defeat in a sense. It's not as simple as that, but one thing we do want to do, you know, lead up to in going through the dialogues, is get to the big one, which is the Republic, and I'm trying to target that sometime in later on in the year, and that one is where Plato explains his position and very clearly, and it is still today one of the most significant political philosophy texts that you can study. And so, you know, there's loads to this.
And often people sort of try to write off the importance of studying Plato today, don't they? By kind of saying, well, he had these kind of very anti-democratic ideas, or at least that's the kind of stuff he puts in the mouth of Socrates, and for that reason, you know, we shouldn't listen to Plato. But I mean, I think we'll draw a line under that for the moment, but just to say there's a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more interesting than that, and that's a sort of unfair treatment in one direction.
You can say what you like, but you know, democracy is not a simple thing to understand. And so one of the reasons for showing the emergence of democracy is it's not like our democracy. And you could ask the question, which one's more democratic, the Athenian or ours? And yeah, well, I'll let you think about that.
Well, on that very note, so Dave's just given us a few minutes there on his understanding of how democracy emerges. But this, you know, I stress that this isn't, as people who've been to previous sessions will know, this isn't a sort of lecture by David or any one of us. It's very much us trying to think through these texts and these ideas sort of collectively and bounce ideas off each other. So we, as I said at the start, we really are engaging with some, you know, pretty heavy philosophical ideas this evening, hopefully in a very interesting and, you know, a very approachable way. But they're big ideas. We really would like to put some questions to the group this evening and get you know, get a kind of two-way conversation or multiple part conversation going. So do please feel free to put your hand up and ask any points you like, always stressing there is not any such thing in this material, you know, as a stupid question or a basic question. If you're reading this material thinking, gosh, I don't really understand what he means here, or that just seems wrong, I think it's really important to say, isn't it, David, that we're all thinking that at different times. We're all thinking, but no, or I don't know if I agree with that. And so, you know, feel free, just raise your hand and we will come to you for questions. But I think, David, you'd like to start with Phaedo, is that right? And you've got
Yeah.
a kind of a couple of little questions to get us going on that subject. Do you want to just sort of just set the scene of what
Yeah.
Phaedo is very basically? What's going on in Phaedo?
That's a good question. Right. So, what, in one simple sense, I mean, it says it very clearly. This is an attempt to understand the soul and the immortality of the soul. That's a hell of a challenge for a start, right? Because most people these days, unless you're religious, you're going to reject the notion of the soul because that's the kind of thing that we do in a kind of materialist way that we look at the world. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to us. The immortality of the soul, why? Just why do we need to do this? And I think once you look at this, you see that what Plato's doing is he's introducing a couple of really big ideas that he uses to explain things, not just in this context, but elsewhere. And one of them is the forms. And that takes a bit of getting your head around. What does he mean? Not that we think, but what does he mean by it? And then how does that link to the immortality of the soul? And I think the way he does it, putting it as simply as I can, is he says that the forms are the way we understand things. So therefore, that's our guide to, if you like, judge whether we know something. So if we know the form of, say, so height or length or whatever it is he uses, largeness, that's the one, then if we know that form, then we have a way of saying what we mean when we say something is large. So it's an abstraction, a generality, and that's important to get your head around what he's trying to do there. And so instead of looking at the specifics of the real world, the body version of the world that we live in, us and everything around us, ideas are separate to that. And I think that is huge. And if you know anything at all about philosophy, you'll spot it all over the place. So that's that. And so what he does is he introduces a dualism, a kind of separation between mind and body, which you should be, relatively familiar with if you've done anything. I mean, Descartes does it. It goes on. People argue about it all the time. I argue about it with scientists because they don't believe that anything is separate from material reality. And I say, well, go on then. How do we understand art then? And then we get into arguments. So that's one thing. And then the other big idea, which comes back as well in the Meno even more, is this idea that when we say we learn something, what we mean is we are remembering what the soul knew before we were born. And that's that's quite a big one to take on board. But what he's getting at is that some things we don't learn. I think he more or less says we don't learn anything, but some things are not to be learned. They are there already. And that, if you want a modern analogy to that, he's a bit old now, but Noam Chomsky sort of said that there's an innateness about language that you're born with. And what you're getting at is there's no way a child could learn language unless they were already given some of it, given the tools to do it with. And so that's not exactly the same thing as what Plato's doing, but you can see that there's a link there. If there are ideas already there, you've just got to recover them, recollect them. So that they're kind of big problems to deal with and say, do we buy it, basically? Do we buy the theory of forms? And if so, why is that important to understand the immortality of the soul? And in the Meno, it's the other way around. The immortality of the soul is the way that we understand how we learn.
Okay, I'm gonna pause you there for a minute, David. I might come back to you in a second. So let's pick up on that point about the forms then. If you've got questions about the forms, Dave's given us a little introduction there, but maybe you've got deeper questions about what's this all about. Maybe we need to sort of unpack the idea a little bit more. I wouldn't be surprised if we need to do that. But also maybe you've got points that you want to come back on something David said there, or indeed anything on the democracy points from earlier on. Let's just, while you're sort of getting your thoughts together and thinking of things you might want to say, and as I say, just raise your hand. You should have a little button on your screen that enables you to do that under reactions. But if you're having trouble with that, just stick a note in the chat and we will let you know how to do that. But as I say, while you're sort of getting your thoughts together, the Phaedo is this situation where we are now at the end of the story we've been looking at in recent sessions, where Socrates has gone on trial. He's been found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he has been ordered by the state to drink poison, which will kill him. And the Phaedo is taking place in the hours leading up to that fateful moment. And how do we encounter this story? Well, it's not a direct bit of reportage in that sense. We actually meet two characters. One, I think I pronounce his name Echecrates. I'm not sure if I'm saying that in the correct way. Please, someone put me right. But anyway, he's talking to this guy called Phaedo and says, "Oh, you were there when Socrates died. We knew that he'd been poisoned, but we didn't know exactly what happened, what was going on. Can you tell us?" And then, thank goodness, Phaedo has a remarkable memory and can record all the words that both Socrates and the others are discussing. And Plato writes it down, and that's how we get this volume. But I wonder if anyone's got questions about the forms. This is something that you hear a lot about, but do we really understand it? Raise your hand if you've got a question. I will endeavour to see all those people.
I'll chip in. I'll chip in with not about the forms, although maybe I'll get to that. A couple of questions, thoughts.
Okay.
One about Dave's point about democracy and the fact that Plato doesn't like it, and what is different about democracy then versus democracy now. So thinking about democracy, today, in my mind, it's intimately associated with the notion of discussion and debate, as in, it's about people trying to get their own sense of what's truthful and arguing from their own point of view about that, and that having a faith in people, involving a faith in people that collectively we can work things out and so on. And people who don't like democracy tend to get very nervous and upset about debate and so on. So that's why I'm slightly surprised. What is this? Obviously, most of Plato's, if not all of his writings, involve debate and discussions with things, ideas being knocked around, and Socrates having at them, and so on. So why was Plato against democracy? That's the question there. And then there's just a general question about the Phaedo, if that's the correct pronunciation. So I read the Maulins, or many of the Socratic dialogues in sequence 10, 15 years ago. And I remember really enjoying them until it got to the Phaedo and thinking, oh, this is the bit I was going along with this up to now. I was generally agreeing with it. But this is the point where it started to sound like the ravings of someone who's slightly mad. And I'm thinking of particularly of the forms, because that to me they do seem very, very strange idea. And I also it appeared to me that maybe this was the point where Plato was having established Socrates as a great dramatic sort of device. He could talk through all these ideas and debates using the dramatic voice of Socrates to mouth them. But then after this point, he started sneaking in his own ideas, and he also switched from dismantling or criticizing ideas, which is what Socrates up to that point had been doing, to pushing forward his own ideas, which frankly, as I say, seem a bit bonkers. So any thoughts on any of that?
David, just before you
Yeah.
jump in, sounds like you've got lots to say about that. So I've noticed that Jane and Rebecca have questions. So Jane and Rebecca and anybody else, please be patient. I've got you logged, and we'll come back to you in a minute. But it's probably best if Dave answers this question first, and then we'll take your questions.
Well, kind of, yeah. So I think it's best to do the Plato democracy thing with the Republic. And it's like, it's kind of not fair to try and do it without reading that. How can I put it? So I think you're right in the sense that the whole thing about the Socratic dialogues is, and Plato wrote them, so Plato as well, is that these are trying to get you to engage with a discussion. They're not finished, complete thesis, that's it, you've got to learn it and deal with it. They're open. And in fact, if you read enough Plato, he criticizes himself. And he doesn't just say, accept what I say, I'm right. He actually engages in arguments from the other side. I think Parmenides is one dialogue where he takes completely a different tack and lets Parmenides attack him. And so it's not as simple as that. So that's one thing. On the forms, okay. So I think what we're dealing with here is the emergence of abstract ideas. And that is to be applauded. And we'd be in a real mess if we didn't have it. And philosophy is about that. So you have to be careful, because it's not about the material world we live in. It's about thought. It's about how do we reason and how do we get an understanding of things through thought. And that's what Plato's engaged in. And you might find that what he does isn't good enough for you to explain an idea. But there's something in it. So I think there's a couple that I pick on. So I'll just do them, and then people might want to say they disagree or whatever. But one is beauty, right? The form of beauty, which fits really nicely with this idea of an abstract idea that you can then apply in different circumstances. So he says, Helen was meant to have been so beautiful that they put 1,000 ships out to go and get her back from Troy. But she wasn't that beautiful, because she wasn't as beautiful as a goddess, Athena or whoever, Aphrodite. And so this idea isn't Helen, it's the idea of what beauty is. Now, do you understand what beauty is? Maybe not, but surely that is the inquiry we should have, is to try and understand that, to be able to say whether one real object has some of it or not. And I also think the way that he does it is say that you get some objects that have both the one form and its opposite in themselves. They're a contradiction. And that's true about a lot of things. So he does that with, I think, with largeness and the sticks. So how can you be a tall stick and yet be short at the same time? So that idea doesn't stick very well. That was terrible. And so so what is the idea that tells us if something's large? Well, it's not which stick it is it? It's something abstract that we're talking about. It's probably easier with odd. So I like oddness because it goes into mathematics, and these ideas are heavily involved in mathematics if you let yourself go there. So oddness isn't the same thing as 3, but 3 is odd. So what is oddness? That's a mathematical problem. And as a mathematician, you should be able to answer it. So he was getting at abstract ideas. I've said a lot. Oh, shush.
That's a great way to start us off. Thank you for that. Yeah, the emergence of abstract ideas. I think it's it's right to say, isn't it, that until we get this kind of Greek civilization, that life has been a sort of basic struggle for survival and just to kind of keep going. It's not until we see the Greeks, and that's not to say other people weren't having similar thoughts about things, but somehow this Greek civilization flourishes enough that we can get these kind of immensely sophisticated dialogues coming out. Okay. Jane and Rebecca, perhaps we can just take your questions, each of you, and then Dave, you might want to work them together or answer them separately. Over to you. But Jane, what was your question?
Hello. Yeah, my question is very simple, actually. I wasn't at the last discussion, but you just introduced forms, and I haven't come across forms before, and I just wanted just a basic definition of what that was. It's sort of an abstraction, you're saying, and it could be the difference. It could be it's between the mind and the body. It could be something between the mind and the body, something purely in thought. If you could just give it a basic. I think you've said a bit more since I first put my hand up, so I'm getting a better understanding with beauty and oddness.
Yeah,
I think that's a perfect question, Jane, to kind of Dave thinks about this a lot and kind of comes at things. Sometimes it's good to sort of just track back and say, let's go from the very basics here. What actually, are we talking about? Which is great. Thank you for that. So, Rebecca, what was your question?
he's muted.
Yeah, no. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it wasn't actually a question. It was a comment upon Plato's relationship to democracy. But if you want specifically questions at the moment, I can park that, and maybe we could come back round to it.
As chair, what I'm going to do, David and Rebecca, is suggest that maybe we scoop up these questions on democracy to sort of think about it. And if we've got some time at the end of the session, we might prefer a bit of light relief on democracy after we've waded through the forms for a bit. I don't know about light relief, but yeah, let's see if we can come back to these later. I'll make a note to come back to that. Lovely, thank you. Okay, David, for those of us who haven't been familiar with these ideas for a very, very long time, could you sort of put forms in a nice, simple sense for us? Probably
not, but I will try. So what Plato's doing is he's trying to say that the forms are abstract ideas, but they're very different to a description of something because they're an abstraction, a generality, and they have to hold truth. So they're true about whatever it is they are a form of. So our job as a philosopher, if you just say that's how you want to understand it, is to understand the forms. If we understand the forms, then we can apply that knowledge to real life, to objects around us, to ourselves, and so forth. Okay, Dave, let me put some questions to you. Yeah, please, yeah. Nice direct questions, and other people feel free to raise your hand, as I say. So, if I'm right, if I've understood this correctly, and maybe I haven't, there is a form, really, for Socrates, for everything, isn't there? And of course, let's take the good old philosopher's table, a table. Is there a form of a table, and how is that different to a normal table? Perhaps we could start there. See, the table comes up in a different sense all over the place, right? I mean, because what is a table, and that's where you're getting at. Well, what makes it a table rather than bits of wood? Because it is bits of wood, unless it's plastic. And what makes it a table is how you use it. So is there a form of a table? Well, it's got to be able to do a job that a table does. So I think that's the best I could come up with is right. Would be our attempt to find the form of a table. Now, as a designer, you do that. Definitely, it's a real problem, right? What makes something useful as a table or not? philosophically, is that deep enough to claim that that really is one of, you know, Socrates or Plato's forms? I'm a bit loose on that one. And I think the problem we have is, you know, if you do this, you end up trying to say, well, is this a form or that a form, and so on, and you that isn't going to help so much. Right?
So hunting down forms is not necessarily the way to go.
Yeah, I would suggest that you'll get trapped, right? And you know, so like Plato is doing this because he had philosophical problems that he wanted to solve, not because he got a list of forms.
Yeah. So there's not a perfect world somewhere, some sort of strange world where it's just a lot of forms all sort of moving around, and that's kind of different. You're saying, I'm taking that we use forms to kind of get at the problem, you know, the philosophical problem we want to address. So,
Yeah.
Something where he might say there is a form would be what, sort of beauty or
that's an easy
virtue or something like that.
Well, yeah. Now, virtue, you're getting there because in the, you know, the whole problem here is, I mean, that's what the Meno starts off with. This is like, what is virtue again? Yeah, and guess what? Can't answer it. So, but what he's getting at is that there's an abstraction. So if you have, you know, courage, loyalty, etc., that you can say what they are. You can say this person's loyal. This person has shown courage, but you can't say what virtue is in general. And that's because there's an abstraction, a level of abstraction that we're trying to get at, that Plato's definitely trying to get at, which is what all the Socratic dialogues are about, is can we reach this abstraction, right? Now, and then you can say, well, you know, yeah, but does it even exist? That's an argument, but the point about the forms in another respect is, if we know what they are, then we can use them to judge things. Now, so say we said beauty. So if I said, I'm going to forget a way of explaining this. So if I said, is this art worthwhile? Right? Is it good art? Then that's an argument we have. It's a real argument we have. So we might go into a museum and see something, or not a museum, an art gallery and see something and say, that is awful, right? That isn't art. And so what we got is some kind of comparison or judgment going on where we think we know what the abstract of beauty or good art is, and we're trying to use it. But if we try to explain what that is, we get into a mess. And that's where we're being led.
So the forms are more ways of thinking about things, ways of posing questions, and finding truth by trying to answer those questions, than assuming that there is this kind of, you know, understood form of something, and it's just you, the person thinking about it, might get it or might not, you know, but it's out there and you just have to sort of accept that. It's more a way of saying, well, if there is a form of beauty, say, what is it? What would that constitute? What would that look like? Okay.
But I will say there are some that we should know. So in mathematics, there are plenty. Yeah. So if you say oddness and a mathematician can't answer it, they're not a mathematician, you know. But it's not as easy to answer as you think, because it's the generalization of an idea. So, you know, you can say, well, I've got odd numbers, 1, 3, 5. Hopefully I don't get them wrong, you know. But what am I saying that odd is? And in mathematics, you have to be able to do it. That's real. That's not made up. And
why is this important, David? Why is this dialogue that's supposed to be essentially about, you know, why Socrates is approaching his death with a kind of equanimity and actually, you know, quite relaxed about it, it seems. What the hell has that got to do with, you know, what oddness is?
Because Socrates is happy that he's going to die. And his mates are not, they're miserable. And they're saying to him, yeah, but if you die, you're gone. And we've lost you. And he's saying, no. I'm not gone because my soul will remain, right? And that will go into the afterlife. And the end of the thing is about his view of what the afterlife is. So the question is that they bring to him is, yeah, but how do you know the soul won't die too with you? And the two challenges they raise are, one, that you're saying that soul will survive after your death, that it's immortal. Well, but I don't know. Prove it. And two, well, what if you're reborn again and again and again, and your soul is reborn with you in another context, and then you just wear out. Your soul dies because it's worn out. It can no longer do that. And so this question of immortality of the soul is about saying, well, Socrates isn't going to disappear, right? And he's confident that he isn't. And that's the challenge he's working through. That's why he's trying to prove that soul is immortal. And if it is, good stuff. He's off to go and meet his heroes in the afterlife.
Okay, which leads us nicely onto another sort of foundational question that's been raised in the chat. But I'm going to come to, I don't know if I should say this as Runa or Rune. I don't know quite how to say your name, but do you want to come on camera and ask your question directly, Runa?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, that's great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because this is in the time of Greek mythology before Christianity, and it sounds like Socrates and Plato believed in reincarnation, which was a bit of a surprise to me, given that Christianity that came later had sort of done away with that part. So reincarnation was quite common as a belief in Athens.
Well, look, all I can go on is what I've come across, and it's without doubt that it's there. That Socrates is explaining what the afterlife's like. He's explaining that you get reincarnated dependent on how good you are and how good your soul is. It depends on what you are reincarnated as. If you're a good worker, you come back as an ant. If you're a vicious killer, it's a wolf. And only if you're a philosopher, you might get to be a human again. Right? So you can take it as you like, really. I mean, but I think if you look at Greek mythology, he the end is a very good version of the journey to Hades and Tartarus, and whether you come back up or not, or whether you're tortured and God knows what happens to you, right? So it's very clearly following the Greek mythology. So I'm assuming that was pretty common. I don't think he made that up. I think he just copied it, as it existed already.
So David, you and I have taught physics together, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think I'm correct to say you don't believe, I might be wrong, in the immortality of the soul, the idea of souls going away from Earth and coming back, being reincarnated, and so on. You don't think this, do you? So why do you think this is so important?
I think it's you that don't believe it.
But I mean, my question, David, why? I didn't expect to be reading this and encountering views on the immortality of the soul and whether we go to some strange realm or something. I thought it was all going to be, heavily sort of deep philosophical questions of a different kind of character. So why is all this important? This discussion of the immortality of the soul?
Well, be blunt, if you looked at the population of the earth and asked them how many of you believe in the soul and the afterlife, if you don't, you're in a minority. Religion hasn't gone away, right? And I think, as Rune said, the Greeks, their religion effectively died out to replace by Christianity, which incorporated the ideas which sound very similar to what Plato's explaining, right? So if you're Christian, in some sense, you believe in the afterlife, and if you have a good life, you go to heaven, right? That's, you know, it might not be my personal take on it, but it's certainly a common idea. So we
All
can't.
right.
Yeah.
I get that, but I don't. I suppose my question is more. Although lots of people think that, you know, in the kind of modern scientific understanding of things, I suppose that doesn't fit in. So, what are you saying? There's a sort of different way of seeing this that's not perhaps literally about whether souls go to some, you know, particular place or whether they abide before death or whatever.
You got to take Plato at his word, or Socrates. He believed, dog's barking. He believed that, you know, the soul was reincarnated and it lasted, and it was immortal and lasted forever. You know, if you description is indivisible, invisible, and infinite, right? That's the soul. That's what they believed in, right? And he was trying to prove it philosophically. And this gets to, actually, it's the Meno is going to, I'm going to jump a bit, because there's a bit in the Meno that is crucial to this, what you're asking, and that is, what is it to know something? So I'm going to say it because it's a philosophical abstraction. You don't need it to be in the Meno to understand it. And the point is, if you say you don't believe in God, the key word is belief, because you don't know that God doesn't exist. Because if you did, you could convince me or anyone, and then we wouldn't believe in God. So the big problem or philosophical difficulty, which is a very live one now, is between belief and knowledge. They're not the same. So we all have beliefs, all of us, all the time. So I believe if I walk out the door, I'm not going to be hit on the head by an asteroid, right? I do not know that, but I believe it. So, you know, in the same way, you know, if you believe in reincarnation, you can't know it. But what Plato's doing is trying to, from his point of view, through his own thought and his own philosophy, is to give a reason that fits with what we know. And therefore, you might say, yeah, but I don't accept it. But then the job is you have to disprove it philosophically if you're going to say it doesn't exist. And it's quite hard, you know, it's quite hard. So if someone says to you, I believe in the afterlife, I'm going to heaven, what are you going to do? You can't. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. There's no way out of it, right? So in that sense, he's setting out the problem of how do we know? How do we know what we know, and therefore other people can know it? Or is
Right.
belief? And he does the true belief thing quite well.
Okay, let's pause that for a moment, because I think we might come back to that in, when we look at the Meno more closely. But just drawing out two things here that I've taken then from what you're saying. First of all, the reason that the idea of forms is important is because this whole business that we've been looking at since the beginning of Socrates approaching his death, and why he's approaching it in the way he does, the forms is one of the ways of sort of addressing this idea that, look, there is in some sense a kind of a transcendence somewhere, that there are things that just go beyond the day-to-day of living and the problems of ordinary life, and some of them we can think about in terms of, you know, the abstractions of mathematics, or what is beauty, or it might come to your own life in terms of you know, what am I passing on? What do I leave behind, and that kind of stuff. So there's that, and then the other sort of thing that I'm taking from what you're saying is that it's not when we read these dialogues, it's not so much that, well, actually, when Socrates is talking about the immortality of the soul, he's referring to some other modern concept that this is a sort of analogy of. You're saying, no, it is that, but it means you really have to kind of get to grips with your own argument. You don't have to agree with him, but you have to have your intellectual machinery together to say why you don't agree with him in your own head. And that's the part of sort of developing this philosophic approach to life.
I accept what you're saying, right? Very much. You can't use a modern view of the world, whatever that is, to try and recreate what this should mean, yeah, in the modern view, because that's wrong, right? And you know, Socrates meant what he said. You know, the soul is immortal, therefore I will go to Hades and hopefully come out a good person or meet the people who are my heroes and what have you, right? But the issue is not that. The issue is, can we understand how Plato, Socrates reasoned this through? Can we follow their reason? Because the power of what this is about is the power of our ability, all of us, to reason.
Okay, that's great. That's a nice place to park, because we've got a couple more questions. Harley was letting me know that he had a particular question on some of this, and we've also got Johan. So I'm going to take those two questions. I don't know, Johan, if you want to switch your camera on to ask your question. Sorry, that'd be nice. But first of all, over to Harley. What was your question?
Yeah, picking up on the reincarnation point, and Dave, you saying, you know, mentioning about, you know, people coming back as ants if they're good workers, or, you know, if they're philosophers coming back. You know, I think he talks about them coming back in heaven, basically above the atmosphere. And there's a long section in the text where he talks about how philosophers are training themselves for the afterlife better than anyone else, essentially, but because as he sees it, the senses, our, you know, sight and so on, mislead us. Yep. So others embrace that. They don't care. They embrace the pleasures of the flesh and all that kind of stuff. Whereas philosophers go, well, that's all misleading, not important. I should just ignore them as much as possible. And the philosopher basically spends his whole life learning how to do that. And then they're ready to go to the soul, become a soul, you know, without a body, because they've kind of got there already. They've learned to work without the body, and that just feels like retreating inwards somehow, away. The opposite of what I think of as how the route to wisdom, which is by, you know, our senses may be imperfect, but that's why we have each other, because we've all got our own takes on things, and by talking about them and we collectively approach the truth, even if we never quite get there. But then, you know, I also understand that of course he does spend all his time arguing and talking to people. So how does that all fit together, Dave? Explain it.
That's really good. I'm just going to take Johan's question as well, Dave, and then you can answer them either one or, you know, together, however you feel. Johan.
It's not really a question. It's more of a comment. I think you've got to keep in mind when discussing these texts that these early intellectuals are taking baby footsteps in understanding what it means to be human, and, you know, asking the question like, what is a good life? What is left behind us? Because they're well aware that we all die. So the question then is, what remains after that? You know, it's kind of like trying to answer that existential question, which even crops up in Christianity. So I think, you know, it's like in an ancient society like this, the very early attempts to ask this question and answer this question about what it means to be human and what is left after we have gone, kind of thing. This is, you know, the way I would look at it. So, and I think you got to be careful, you know, like in what Harvey just said about, like, I thought reason was discussing and blah blah blah, because they haven't got that far. You know, they're in the really early stages of trying to understand how do we exist as humans, what is it that you know we have in common, and how do we understand ourselves and our life? Yeah. So these sort of questions are much more basic and almost primordial, rather than, you know, they haven't yet got to reason and what does it mean to reason and stuff.
That's a lovely point, Johan. Thank you very much. I personally find that very helpful contribution. I also like the way you're addressing us from above the clouds, by the look of it, as Harley was suggesting. So it's lovely to be addressed by a philosopher in heaven. But thank you, and thanks for all the contributions. They're all great. They're all helping us to understand. So Dave, take from those two comments, questions, what you will.
Yeah, I think Johan's spot on. We can't come at this from a modern perspective. You know, I think we have to say that again and again, is like, because that's us bringing us into it and trying to see why it doesn't fit. I think you know, the concept of the individual and the individual having the ability to speak and reason out problems is very much, as was said, is very much a new thing. I mean, so when we did the history of democracy, we're sort of saying the history of people being able to find a voice is as much as anything else. And philosophically, that's the same thing. It's the attempt to find a way to start to think about ideas. And so that's the huge thing that Plato's done, is he's broken ground. He's said there are ideas and they're not the same thing as what your senses tell you. And I think that is massive, huge, because it separates out a realm of ideas, the abstract realm, whatever you want to call it. And that is massive for humanity, because without it, we'd be stuck in the day-to-day constantly. We'd never get beyond anything. Material reality is a bit disappointing unless you can think beyond it. And so you're beginning to see the potential to use the mind to work things out. And I think that's massively important and impressive, that happened in a city state, which is, it's not very big. You know, I think the male population who could vote in the peak of Athens, I think, because I'm working this out as I go along, is about 40,000. And so I don't know where you live, but, you know, there's a darn sight more than 40,000 people near me. So I think it's having the ability to bring that to the surface, the ideas that Plato's doing, is a miracle in a sense. It just shows the power of human beings to really reason and think and try and understand the world around them, and try and understand the abstract world. And that's where we're going with this. Because if we can say that there is an abstract world, these ideas exist as ideas, not as things, then that allows us to then bring those ideas back into the real world, so to speak, and see if we can change things and build things and do things in a different way. And, you know, all of those things are just, I mean, it must have been.
Right, I'm just gonna cut in, Dave. Sorry to cut across you. It's just that we kind of want to round up our time on Phaedo for the minute. And there's a really important point here that I think some people might be thinking but just not asking. Two related aspects to it. First of all, I think it would be good just to square off our attitude to Plato's sort of dismissal of the world of the senses and so on, not least because, would it be fair to say that we've kind of outgrown that that attitude? You know, we live in a scientific world, and the scientific world is all about observation and learning things from the material world. So
I'm going to stop there.
No. I want to just put a second point, and then you can
go on.
the whole thing up, which is that the lots of people would also criticize our society, I suppose, our civilization, for being too much in our head in terms of these abstract ideas, worrying about abstract ideas, but not really ever engaging with the sort of reality on the ground and you know, things like that. That's definitely a criticism that's out there. don't we have Plato to blame, A, for holding back science by saying don't look at the material, the sensual world, and secondly, aren't we a bit too obsessed with the abstract instead of the real, whatever that means? Okay, two massive questions, just a couple of minutes on them if you will, and then we'll move on to the Meno.
Oh, right, so don't keep using science as if it's something different and it explains things on the way that Plato sees them. If you look at where science is in many of the questions it asks, they are very philosophical. You know, what is the universe? You know, is it going to end? Is it going to keep going? Is it repeating? What is it? You know, quantum mechanics, how the hell do we understand that? Because it doesn't make sense. And it challenges your views on reality, time, what is, I can go on, there's a lot there. But the point being is that without the philosophical tools to know when you're making philosophical mistakes in the ways you think about things, you just don't get there, you miss it, right? So I don't think that you can say that Plato is leading us astray and stopping us looking at the world we live in. I think that's slightly unfair. I think it's the other way around, completely the other way around. I think if you look at what people think science is or think, you know, knowledge is, they think it's collecting statistics. They think it's data. And they think that that explains things. It doesn't explain a thing, nothing at all, right? It's the ideas you put into your data that then either work or don't work. And so I think the thing that we miss and are losing, and you know, one of the reasons we're doing this series of discussions is because the abstract world is being narrowed and reduced and ignored. And so if you go to a school and you know, where's the abstract world in a school? Where's the chance to think in a classroom about your ideas? It's not. It's very mechanical, right? Even in a so-called abstract subject, it's mechanical. And so I think what we need to do is learn to think again. And then, you know, it'll change. You know? So, but at the moment, the problem is the lack of the abstract, not too much of it.
Really, I mean, that told me. Really interesting way of seeing that. I'm just going to point to Raphael's picture, the School of Athens. Wish we had a version of it to show. You know, famously, Plato, Aristotle. Plato is pointing up to the heavens. Aristotle has got his hand suggesting down to the ground. I think we could say that without Aristotle coming along and going, all right, you know, there is things to learn by observing the world. It's not just something that's going to lead us astray. Anyway, Johan has another point to contribute, and I'll see if I can use that point to also move us into the Meno. I bet we can somehow. Johan, no pressure. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you've got to go back to sort of like a precursor, you know, because like I think what they're doing here is drawing, because without the notion of abstraction and abstract thought, you have only opinion, right? Because you have the individual sensations and their emotions and so on, and yes, you can empathize with another person, you can understand another person, but it's subjective at the end of the day, to put it in modern language, right? Whereas they are struggling towards trying to understand what is it that there is in common, what are the kind of abstractions, universal things which exist kind of outside of us, outside of this world of subjectivity, as we would say, or outside of our own individual opinions and sensations. That's where they're moving towards, right? And I think if you take a step back, you will say how fucking brilliant that is, right? Given, you know, the date, the level of development of their society, they are, you know, way beyond geniuses, because even today, as you mentioned, people cannot see this distinction even, you know, because of this relativism and all this kind of stuff that goes on, and you know, like this lived experience, subjectivity and what have you. So I think, you know, you've got to put your mind back to kind of their time, their, you know, struggling with these questions to realize why they're then raising the issue of the soul, right? Because, you know, it's one way of them thinking, what is the outside of ourselves as individuals, and therefore what carries on when we're not here, and to realize that it's part of answering this question of how do we get away from just individual opinions and individual sensations. I'll stop there because, yeah.
Well, Johan, that's fantastic, because I couldn't have introduced Meno with a better point, really, which of course is looking at this whole question of the difference between true belief and knowledge. Dave, do you want to just talk a little bit more about how we encounter that in the Meno as you see it?
Okay, so I mean, the Meno's got lots of things going on in it, but it's basically the start of it is the dialogue is what is virtue. So, you know, the usual Socratic quizzing of Meno and trying to say, well, you know, you come from this guy Gorgias, who's a famous sophist. Surely you know. Tell me what it is. And then we get into a toing and froing, and as usual, it ends in you don't know. But I think the point being is, and it comes back to the forms thing a bit as well, is like saying, well, you can tell me there's a list of virtues. You can tell me, you know, who you think might have those virtues, but you can't tell me what virtue is, the general form of virtue. And so you get to the aporia, where Meno does the quote, says, I've been stung by a stingray. I'm paralyzed. I can't do anymore, which is a fantastic way of imagining what Socrates does to people. So I think that bit, you know, is we're used to, because we've done a few of these. We know what we're doing with that. But then it pushes back and says, well, how would you teach it? How would you teach virtue? Not, you know, previously Socrates said, well, if I don't know what it is, I can't teach it, which is fair enough. A fair point. But then he says, well, you know, well, how do we learn anyway? And then the slave boy bit. So what Socrates is doing is saying, well, we don't learn, we remember. We remember what we already know, what the soul knew when we were born, but has forgotten. So I'm going to prove it. I'm going to get this slave boy and he's going to work out some maths. And they do the thing about the square root of 8, which is, you know, takes a little bit of unpicking because of the way, I mean, it's not easy to do geometry in a dialogue, but they do it. And it's fascinating because, you know, if you know anything about teaching, you've even tried teaching, some of us have, you'll recognize what's going on, right? Because you're trying to elicit from a child something that they formally don't know, but you want them to know it, and you believe that they can know it. And then we're into a difficult thing, is, you know, what are we doing when we're teaching? And we can have a discussion about that. But what Socrates says is, the guys remembered this stuff. It's recollection. It's not learning, and that gets you a long way with where this dialogue goes. And then, you know, the point about true belief is different. It's like so he meets Antyllus, who's one of the guys who actually charges him with perverting the youth later on, and leads to his downfall, and says, well, look, if we can teach virtue, there must be teachers of virtue. There must be somewhere. Someone's learned it somehow. So let's recount all the famous, you know, people, dignities, or whatever you want to call them, of Athens, who were good people. The one I'll mention is Pericles, who was, you know, created the state of Athens as we know it, and ended up building the Pantheon on the Acropolis, right, through his victories and all the rest of it. Yet his son was horrible. useless. And so he says, well, you know, even the best of us can't teach it. And that gets at you, because if you've got children, you'll know what's going on there, right? So how do we impart what we want to on our child? And sometimes you just can't, right? And so there's a bit of truth in this that we all recognize individually. But then, you know, what he's saying is, well, what are we left with then? If we can't teach it, we can't learn it, what are we left with? You believe it, right? You have belief. So Pericles had the right beliefs. Where did he get them from? And this comes back to where you might, you know, say, well, we're back stuck where we were before. From a divine inspiration is all that we're left with as a possible source of the beliefs that these great men had. And I think that sort of more or less is where we are. And then the point about belief is massive, because if that's what we're left with, is it knowledge? And obviously, if Pericles has the right beliefs of how to run Athens and so on, does he know what they are, or does he just have them? Is it some kind of instinct or intuition? And if he can't explain them and he can't teach them, then they're not knowledge. And so you've got this is a real philosophical problem today. It's what philosophers argue about today in this epistemology. What is the difference between belief and knowledge? And they haven't got an answer for it in a minute.
I found this particularly important, and actually it was the Meno that really I began to see quite why you're as passionate as you are about this material, Dave, which is very passionate, but more importantly, but that you're always making the point whenever you and I discuss this, and in these sessions, that, you know, this is really important stuff for today, even though it's looking at some quite antiquated and perhaps even strange ideas, you know, immortality of the soul and so on. Not least because the two, I absolutely see why you brought the two works together, because, to be honest, a lot of the proofs that Plato is putting forward through Socrates in Phaedo don't really feel to me like what I would consider sort of legal or mathematical proofs. You know, you read them, you think, well, yes, all right, you've sort of argued your way through it. But like you were saying before, I myself can see where I'd argue that there's some holes there or what have you in your argument. But then the other side of it is the Meno, isn't it? Where this idea of, but you're sorting out now what we can call knowledge and what we can call belief. And actually, it's not a mathematical proof that, I mean, anyone, correct me if I'm wrong, and please keep your questions coming. It's not mathematical proof that we're looking at, even though we sometimes invoke mathematical situations in these dialogues. It's almost like situating, like Johan was saying, situating yourself in Socrates' argument and seeing, right, do I go with that? Am I in the spirit of what he's saying? Or if I'm not, but if I'm not, why am I not? But you can tell Plato clearly is a teacher, isn't he? The idea of aporia, I mean, that is in some ways taking students in a modern classroom to a situation where they're sitting there going, what? You can't be, you know, I'm all confused. I'm upset. I don't know. You know, landing in that place is probably the thing that you're instructed not to do these days. And also the idea of just drawing out something from a student, you know, sort of invoking something in them rather than just saying, and here's the rules of a particular mathematical formula or whatever. Anyway, just some observations there. Please, if anyone's got some points, we've only got, you know, about sort of 13 minutes left now, and I do want to come to those democracy questions if we can. Has anyone, you know, if you want to take both works together, anyone got observations on this? I spent a lot of time in the Aporia reading these, going, what is this about? This is all a bit weird. I don't think I understand. You know, I think by the time I got to the end, I'd really enjoyed the process, but that doesn't mean it was plain sailing all the way through. Did anybody else have that experience? You know, people, let us know what you think. And for you, Dave, is there a particular question you want to put to people concerning the Meno? You know, is there a particular question that you want to hear people's answers on?
Okay, the Meno paradox. I must put this right. If you know something, then you don't need to know it. So there's no point looking at it. If you don't know something, how do you even begin to look for it? So we can't learn anything. Get out of that.
I shall let people think of some points to raise. It would be really good. I mean, above all, I just don't want Dave walking out of the session thinking, well, I gave my opinion and everyone just bought it and thought that's fine. Thank you to those who have pitched in. And also, what do we make of this idea of divine inspiration, everybody? If we think there is a difference, if we think, you know, some things like what is good or what is virtue, we can't easily define or something. And if we have opinions of things and knowledge, where does it all come from? If you don't think it's divine inspiration, where does it come from? And how does that relate to what Socrates is saying here?
Yeah.
I'll just sort of give a few moments to see if people want to come back on that. Any particular thoughts or?
Yep.
Rebecca's in.
Go on.
Rebecca, please.
Unmute.
I think you're muted. Yeah.
I think, no, I've unmuted. I think philosophy's kind of doubled back to that in the 20th century with the problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
So I was struck rereading of the Phaedo, whichever, this afternoon by I really liked, I'd forgotten it, I really liked Simmias's idea about the soul is to the body as the harmony is to the lyre. Thought what a beautiful idea. And in the 20th century, late 20th century, that became Daniel Dennett calling consciousness the hum of the machinery. And I just had this moment where I thought, God, philosophy's really gone downhill, hasn't it? Because, you know, if you think of the harmony of the lyre on the one hand and the hum of the machinery on the other. So I think some of these questions like reoccur, or very similar questions reoccur in a slightly different form, for what that's worth.
That's beautiful contribution. I'd forgotten about Dennett's. Yeah, he's a sort of we're kind of meat machines guy, isn't he? So again, yeah.
You see, there's no abstraction, right? So a problem we have to deal with science and scientists who go a step too far, is they want to kill it off. They want to kill off the realm of ideas as if it's just, like you say, just meat doing something, right? And I think that, I mean, anybody who's thought about this at any level, you come up against that. You're forced to. So if you're a materialist, you know, if politically you have a materialist perspective, when it comes to ideas, you're in a deep trough because you don't know how to get out of it. And you can look, and I did this as a youngster, you can look through Marx and Engels as many times as you like to find out where is the materialist understanding of consciousness. And there isn't one, because what they do is very clever. They just assume it exists, right? And so, you know, these things don't go away. They come back, as you said, in a different shape or form because they're unresolved. So I think, you know, there's plenty there. And on Gareth's divine inspiration, the modern version of that, you know, it's really worth thinking through what it means, is intuition, which is fundamental to philosophy and is everywhere. What is it? What is intuition? And, you know, so you can call it divine inspiration if you like, but the modern version is to call it intuition. It's the same thing. It comes out of nothing.
I was just looking back through my notes to go, oh yeah, I remember now. Socrates disagrees with this attunement of the lyre idea, and I was desperate to find out why and what his argument was, and I can't find it in my notes, and we're running out of time. So if anyone can pitch in with
because he thinks the soul and the body are antagonistic.
That's
is
it.
a big part of it. Yeah, mainly.
Very, very good. Thank you for that. That's made me feel better. Johan, I can see that you've got a question. I know Harley wants to ask a couple of questions, and I'm just going to mention in terms of, you know, we've gone nowhere near Anaxagoras and the idea of a sort of intelligence, and I had to, in the reading, work out the difference between logos and nous or nous, or however you want to pronounce that, and then the demiurge that we might encounter later in the Timaeus and so on. Oh my goodness me. But just to say, what's the name of the physicist? I forget his name, but he's written a book now about Anaxagoras, saying that he wants to sort of locate the beginnings of physics in Anaxagoras. Yes. Say the name again, Dave?
Ravelli.
Yes, Ravelli. Check that book out. Very interesting. I'm going to come to Johan first. Johan, if you can make the point briefly, and Harley, I'll say the same to you. Off you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a comment again that this question of consciousness is a, you know, primordial question, or a universal question, and this is the way that they're posing it. You know, today we would talk about consciousness. Is it a machine? And this AI debate that's going on, you know, yeah, if you have enough nodes, will you get a conscious being or not? But in their day, when such machines and analogies didn't exist, they're asking the question, you know, like, how do we as human beings exist? You know, because we are conscious and we can think and we can argue and have abstractions, but they're asking, you know, like, in the very early days, what is that? What is consciousness? How is it that we exist as humans, essentially? Yeah.
The very first thing I wrote down, Johan, when I started reading the Phaedo was this point, of how can a human being approach death in the way Socrates seems to be doing, you know, which goes to the heart of it, doesn't really, it really picks up on what you're saying. Harley, again, to make your point briefly, because we need to wrap up soon.
Yeah, as quick as I can. So Dave was talking about the importance of ideas coming out of this, and just wanted to say that the bit I really loved about the Phaedo was the end, where he ends up going into this detailed description of the heavens and the way that the different channels of water and so on cascade through the center of the earth, and it's just, I absolutely love that, and that's reminded me of the Republic. If we ever get to that, as a sort of supercharged work of the imagination, so I really love that side. And just the other little point was that the whole question of suicide, which is what the Phaedo kind of hinges on. Is he right to let himself die? Everyone's upset about it. He says he's preparing for the afterlife. That's the important bit. And that's where Christianity went for many years. The important thing, you know, the Renaissance brought in humanism and the idea that we prepare for life rather than death. So I prefer that view of things to the way Plato saw it.
Lovely couple of points. Thank you. We have 4 minutes left, and I did promise that we would at least come back to democracy. So, Rebecca, do you want to just make your point as briefly as you can, please, on democracy? And Dave, just a minute from you.
Okay, as briefly as I can. Well, the Athenians didn't have democracy. They had democratic processes for a minority elite. It's just an observation. So once they'd excluded all the women and all the slaves and all the people who couldn't leave their farms, which was, you know, something like 90% of the population of Attica. And also, but then even within that, Plato is not a democrat, partly you could say because it was entirely democratic processes that killed Socrates, so he didn't think that had worked out terribly well. And also, as is very clear from the, excuse my pronunciation, from the Phaedo in particular, he doesn't really like people all that much. He has this kind of elitist disdain for a lot of things, for the passions, for the body, you know, for emotions, for the common people, for the many. So he kind of like debates in a sense on his own terms within the context of a minority elite. That would be my example. That would be my answer to that one. That's me.
Really nice. I really appreciate that. Johan, I don't know if your point's connected to that. Do you want to just come in very briefly?
It's just really, I missed the previous session and I didn't know this, ancient philosophy series was running. But when I read The Trial of Socrates, the first parts of the book, it really blew my mind, really. And I personally think it'd be really worthwhile having just a session on democracy and what comes out of the Socrates trial discussion. And then, as Rob was saying, sorry, Dave, the Republic, because I've got a particular inference of what comes out of the trial, Socrates' arguments in the trial, which I don't think really, I haven't seen, I haven't heard other people saying that. And I think it's well worth discussing that.
That's a lovely point, because Dave, do you want to sort of talk just a little bit maybe about how we can keep this conversation running sort of in the email and so on, rather than addressing those points explicitly? Let's try and take this conversation offline.
Right.
Yeah.
So just a couple of things. Technically, I want to create a WhatsApp group so that you can all join in and keep this going, loosely between discussions. And I will sort of monitor it and look out for people's comments and what have you, and that might help a bit. So what I'll do is I'll email that out in response to this meeting and invite people to take part in that. So that's a technical thing. But then and I am definitely aiming at the Republic. So don't worry, we're going to get there. But there's so much in what Plato's done. It might take me a little while. And I will, again, email out the next discussion and where we're going to go with that. And I won't do the Republic straight away, because there's a couple more that I want to look at. And I'll try and give you plenty of notice to get hold of it and to read it and to follow through on this discussion. On the democracy thing, Rebecca, I think you're a tiny bit negative, given that democracy had never existed at all in any shape or form. Then the whole thing about the reforms that Cleisthenes brought in was that he opened it up to, there were 4 classes of people according to wealth, and he opened it up, the administration, to 3 of them, and the 4th one was invited to take part in their version of a sort of general council, which set the agenda for the rest. That's a bit more sort of democratic than some of the things we've got going on at the moment, I would suggest. But so
our idea of universal suffrage at the moment, our idea of universal suffrage doesn't exclude half the human race, and we don't have slaves. So I do think it is important to mention the slaves and the women.
Right, the slaves is a difficult discussion, because there are quite a lot of foreigners in Athens, and sometimes they're allowed to become Athenian citizens, sometimes not.
Dave, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop it there. I mean, we could talk all night. I was busily chipping in myself there and realised I was muted, which is a blessing for everybody. We have overrun, and I think people, are beginning to sort of say in the chat that they're going to need to leave. So thank you, everybody. Just to point out, in the chat there is a link to the previous discussions if you weren't able to take part in those. We will be letting you know by email about when the next one is and what the readings are and so on. But for the moment, just want to thank everybody here. It's been a really, really tremendous discussion as far as I'm concerned. Thanks ever to David for putting in the work and just thinking through the structure of this. I don't know what's in store for the next one, David. Have you got titles in mind, or are you still thinking about what we're going to go for?
Thinking about the Theatulus, because it will deal with a few things that came up from this. So
you mean Theatulus and not Theaetetus, is that right?
I can't pronounce the darn things, so you can do that. Yeah, that one.
It's Theaetetus, everybody, and I'm glad he said that because I've read Theaetetus and I've begun to think I'd read the entire wrong one. But anyway, it'll be Theaetetus next. But look out for the email from David on, on that and when the next meeting will be. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dave, and we'll be in touch very soon. Thanks, everybody.